So welcome everyone to the webinar. We'll wait a few minutes, obviously, for Mike to join us and a few more folks to get logged on. I haven't done any introduction because I wanted to wait for the man himself to arrive.
You're like, he's gonna show up. I've done that before. I'm like, the worst is, honestly, I think it's actually worse in person because like you have people just kind of like milling around, and like there's always that professor that talks to the person who you're trying to host for too long, and you're like,
yeah, true.
Excuse me.
Should I go ahead and get started?
Let's do it.
Okay. So Mike obviously is going to be doing a lot of his own introduction during this webinar, but I'm happy to sort of start things off. And I'm actually pretty curious myself. I'm a research application scientist at Phitonex. My name is Sutton Thomas. And so Mike and I have been working together since January, and he's the CEO of Phitonex, but before that he did his PhD at UVA and then went on to run FlowJo. And so I'm very curious to hear the path. I don't think I've heard the detailed story. I've talked to a few of his friends from undergrad or grad school. So,
cool.
Here he is.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, and I'll say I'm framing this more as things I wish someone else had told me as I was doing all of that. So hopefully some lessons learned in there. Come on, PowerPoint, you can do it. All right. So I'll be honest, right? When people look at a bio or they like look at a LinkedIn profile, they think, man, this person had like an intention from the very beginning, and like then they just executed along it. And the answer is no. Although you'll see that there is a strategy, there was definitely not an intention. I started this journey way too late. And so hopefully some of the advice I'll give you is starting early, and then we'll get very tactical, both around things on the advice side about when to start the career journey. But then also I'm going to get into some real skills and some real things that I think round out a career from a point of view of, doesn't matter whether you're in academia or whether you're trying to go in industry or you're already in industry. Those things should hopefully help you think around what you could be doing. But I graduated, and then essentially you walk on the lawn, and then you realize, okay, well now what? And so the first part I want to kick off, because I know for some of you it's morning, some of you it's afternoon, right? Is really a rapid fire session of like 8 things I wish someone had told me, and hopefully a little bit of perspective as we consider, well, what does it mean to have an alternative career? Although this is something that I saw actually right after I sold the FlowJo business, and I had to take a photo of it. And I've got actually a couple of photos of this that I took. And I think it's kind of silly, but it kind of represents what is important here. There is no finish line. I always thought, for instance, that the PhD was a finish line, and it's not. Or I thought finishing a short postdoc was a finish line, and it's not. And I thought selling a business was a finish line, and it's not. So maybe some other perspective. So the first thing, though, that I would like to get out of the way is something that continues to honestly like infect our semantics, right? Even when we were talking about this webinar and putting it up on LinkedIn, we kept saying, oh, this is about alternative careers. But this must be the only, it's interesting because our field relies on data, right? Left, right, and center. And yet when we look at the data about where people actually end up in careers, and you look at this over time, you can actually see this is some data from NSF. If you look at this purple line, you can see this is people going into industry, which is of course quite a vague term. And this data is woefully out of date at this point. But there's nothing alternative about it. There's been nothing alternative about it since 2006, really arguably 2001, right? And so there's nothing alternative about alternative career, right? And in fact, I think hopefully when they're running some more recent surveys, we'll see this probably honestly come up. There's obviously a lot going on here, right? It's not just, oh, well, the salaries are better there, or there's very few academic positions, although both those are true. I think that there's actually been a huge amount of growth in industry and a lot more opportunities there. And we'll talk today a little bit around, okay, well, how do you even crack into that? What should you be looking for too? But I want to get that out of the way at the start. There's nothing alternative about an alternative career. And in fact, that's, I think, the first part of this mindset, which is that skills that you need for building a career alternative or otherwise are completely the same. We'll talk about one of them in a moment. Very few of them are taught in grad school. Graduate schools in many ways don't particularly have an interest in that, right? I mean, arguably, they would like you to do well, but you really have to be your own advocate in this regard. And I'll talk about what that means in a moment and the mindset you should have as you start this journey, which is, again, something I wish someone had told me. And as I mentioned, it's not only that there's nothing alternative about a career, there's actually nothing alternative about working on your career, because you have to do it to survive. And I do wish, again, I wish someone had really told me this early on in my PhD, which is that needs to become part of the work product that you're working on, right? It's not just the next paper or the next talk. That career thread always needs to be there, and you need to be starting with ruling things that you don't want to do out, which I honestly think should be the first step, right? So I created a list that said, for instance, like patent attorney, no. Licensing office, no. Professor, no. And I started writing things down that I didn't want to do, and I could circumscribe, if you will, the areas that were still interesting, right? And it turns out like a lot of people they want to explore the universe, boil the ocean. I'd say start there and then move on, and we'll talk about how you can leverage informational interviews to explore that space and really figure out what you need. Before then, you're going to probably talk to a lot of people that are close to you or that you trust or your immediate network. And in many cases, and I'm giving, maybe this is a fair warning, you're going to get a lot of no's. When you tell them that this is something that you would like to do, whether it be an alternative career or the vision that you're setting out. And for me, it was a very vague sort of mix of things. And that vague mix was, I'd really like to be able to mix science and then business development, right? Like I want to understand how partnering works. I thought this was going to mean in the context of pharma and biotech. And as I sort of shopped that story around quite late, honestly, in graduate school, this is what I got back. My PIs, you should really do a postdoc, right? You have to do a postdoc first. Like you have to check that box. Okay. Business school professor, because I figured, okay, well, I'll go ask someone has an MBA and even has a PhD in this. And because you think it's like a PhD, you got to talk to somebody else who has a PhD in business. And this is a quote: "You cannot combine science and business; you need to choose one or the other." Okay. And then the third one was this pharma consultant, this person who had actually done what I was attempting to do and had done it for a number of decades. Again, another no, you cannot do business development out of graduate school. Right. And so I think what's important about this is not necessarily going in and saying, oh, like we can slice and dice every single one of those. But I think we have to realize that each one of these is based on an availability heuristic, right? And this is, this is the Nobel Prize winning work of Tversky and Kahneman, which means that people only have available in their head, right, what their own experience has been. And that's exactly what you're seeing here, right? The PI did a postdoc, the business school professor doesn't know anything really about how you would do that with science. And the pharma consultant obviously did something else before he ended up going into sort of a more business development type role. And so they're false, but they're also motivating, right? It's not necessarily that these people are wrong, but they are false for what they are narrativizing on your career. And I think that's really important, is that you have to create that narrative. And so for me, I honestly collected these no's. I'll be honest, I've gotten, there's tons of people who encourage you. I'll say that these have probably been the most motivating aspects of doing this career journey. And I still remember them, and I still remember the quotes, if that's any measure, right? So what did that journey look like? It's hopefully an interesting one. This is probably the only bio, and then I'll share some other experiences around teams later, because I like to make it more about the team that you join and the team you construct, because this is not, business is a team sport, honestly, and it doesn't matter where you go. In fact, it's kind of interesting because as a graduate student and postdoc, it's very much an individual effort, right? But then anywhere else, any other environment you go into, except for really academia, it is definitely a team effort, 100%, right? There's no doubt about that. And I don't say that just because there's no I in team or something hokey like that. It's quite literally, it's a team that gets it done. I'll show you that in a moment as well. I worked for Red Bull for 2 years as a marketer while I was getting my degree in biochemistry. That ended up being a really interesting experience where I was just gaining direct-to-consumer marketing experience in undergrad. It turned out that kind of ended up being sort of interesting when we talk around how do you enable people with life science tools. Pivotal, no. Interesting, yes. In graduate school, I lived on this range community, which is the original part of UVA, the Jefferson design. I can geek out about that for way too long. But it was interesting because it was actually a World Heritage site, a UN World Heritage site. And so I got to manage that and sort of manage the stakeholders as we were renovating that. It's something we'll talk about quite a little bit is I also then moonlighted. What does that mean? It means I worked on the side, and in graduate school, I thought, well, I'm going to consult and get money for this. That was definitely not the correct assumption. And in fact, what I ended up doing is just biting the bullet and saying, you know what, I'm going to work for free for some of these companies. I'm not going to let it be abusive, but I want to learn, what does a pitch deck look like, right? How do we construct that? How are they fundraising? That's what I did with a company called ITI Health. I helped them craft their pitch deck. I helped understand something that was way far outside my field. I was looking at immunology. They were looking at pancreatic cancer. So help them with their pitch deck. I also worked briefly for a company called Navi Biopharmaceuticals. I actually got to watch that company quite literally. It was a nicotine vaccine company, quite literally burned to the ground. So I had it was about a 3,000 square foot lab, which started with a number of people. And then at the end, I was actually the only man standing over the course of a summer. So another interesting experience, hence the flame here. I also moonlighted for a VC firm. So similar kind of thing where I offered free help and got a lot out of it, right? A lot more value out of that. And then a bit of formal training, although I'll say that on the backside of this, people always ask, well, which courses should I take and what should I do? And what should I, how should I augment my skills? I'd say that the networking aspect and the gaining experience aspects of using your time, particularly in graduate school, are more important than going off and taking a finance or accounting course. You can do that later when you need it, right? And that's exactly what I did. Let the selective pressure of business dictate what you learn on the back end. Get the role that you would like first. What that manifested in for me particularly was an interaction I had, and I'm probably dating myself as usual, when I'm studying the moving training day with, where, I essentially had that in venture capital. I had one day that ended up being pretty pivotal because I just offered my help for free, went up, flew up, assessed the business for a whole day with a venture capitalist. And, the advice I got when I asked him at the end of the day, look, if I really wanted to do this, professionally, either be on either side of this table, right? Be the person who's pitching or the person who's funding, what should I do? And he gave me advice that I thought was kind of flippant at that time, though it turns out to be pretty wise. And it was that nobody gives up until you get a deal done. And I didn't really understand what he was talking about then. It's like, what do you even mean? And I think what he was meaning was, look, the stripe you do have to earn versus all these other no's is that what people are looking at is, can you actually get something done? Can you get either a partnership done? Can you get something done in the market? And that will be when you have essentially, particularly in business, that's when you can establish yourself and say, that's something that I have worked on. If this was something you were going into biotech or pharma, it would really be no one gives a until you really move the needle on a therapy, right? You have to do that. And I'd say that the particular early career advice sort of after you begin in that first role is that that's something that you really have to do focus on. That's the time that, you think, oh, the PhD's done, like I've crossed the finish line, I've got my medal, yay. That's not it, right? In fact, you need to essentially put in that effort, particularly in that early session, to really make that reputation in the new field, right? Because I'll be honest, no one's going to ask you, regardless of the career you go into, like, oh, what was your thesis on again? 2 months into your new role. Because that's not what they care about. They care about your ability to execute. Another one that's unrelated to that, but I think equally as interesting, is that particularly early on in a career, and I advise this time and time again to people, and I'd say my listening rate on this conversion is probably, I don't know, 5 to 10%. I wish it was more. But you have a unique opportunity to take on risk and learn early, right? So, you can certainly choose this stable path and going to work for a large company, but like when you leave graduate school, generally speaking, you do not have a mortgage, right? And so something to consider, right, is the ability to actually take that risk on. I always like people, you think about it in terms of portfolio, obviously risk return, although turns out being essentially asymptotic here, right? From cash out to shares. I'm not providing investment advice, but what I am providing is some career advice that says, look, on the lowest risk and lowest reward here is at academia or an industrial postdoc. I'll be honest with you, I did a number of informational interviews here. I discovered essentially the industrial postdocs were just like academic postdocs, and that's on purpose. So I highly recommend you doing the same journey if that's something that's of interest and you want to go into industry. My advice is always just go into industry. Do not put yourself in a holding pattern of a postdoc with them. Industry investigator in an established company, again, a little bit more risk, a little bit more reward. Industry investigator at a startup is going to depend on the state of that startup, right? And so this is a game that's important to learn, right? Is from seed to Series A, Series B, and all the way up to, if you will, IPO or exit. There's a gradient of both risk and reward in there. The more risk you take on, the more reward, and I'll codify that in a minute. And then founder, of course, is really at the very top of this, where you're taking on just arguably absurd amounts of risk, but also learning a ton. The other thing that you can consider in this reward is there's two different angles to this. The first angle is reward comes in the form of equity, right? It comes in the form of owning a piece of the company. So consider that for a moment. Postdoc has zero ownership. An industry investigator has very likely an option plan, right? An industry investigator in a startup, that same gradient of risk is rewarded with gradients of equity in the company that you're working for. You quite literally have a piece of the pie. And then a founder, of course, has a large portion of it, right? And for those who are really wanting to read a little bit more about this, a great book about this from Nassim Taleb is Skin in the Game, right? And you have, if you think about it, there is more skin in the game here. They're taking on more risk without a doubt, and there's more reward, but they also have a lot more skin in the game. And if that's something that interests you, it's really important. But the other way to see this graph is how much will I learn, right? And in fact, the scale would be very, very far off here, but it is exactly the same graph here. Do you want to work outside of the narrow focus that you have? If you're in an industry academic postdoc, you're going to be just working on that one thing. It depends, and it honestly depends a little bit on the company too. For industry investigators, if you're going to be working outside of that, but you certainly won't be exposed to much of the finance side, much of the commercial side. In an industry investigator in a startup, same gradient. If they're very, very early, you'll see everything. You'll be helping pricing. You'll be helping on partnership, right? If it's a little bit later, a little bit less of that. And if you're the founder, you're going to be doing absolutely everything, right? Like essentially the person who helps maintain our website, for instance, at Phitonex, on the back end is me, right? That's how it is. And so, you can learn a lot more and do a lot more in those roles. But I think, to me, this is a really important concept. I do wish someone had essentially drawn this on a whiteboard for me, early and said, like, look, you should think about it like this. And actually, I just mapped in equity here, pardon me. So, the thing that is beautiful though about a PhD is you have the ability to consume large amounts of information and come up with a strategy. You don't realize it yet, right? And I certainly didn't. I went and took a strategy course, which kind of gave me some frame thinking around, okay, what's business strategy? But I realized in the end that everything that we do in life science is strategic, right? We think about the strategy, we experiment, we execute towards that strategy to essentially get a paper or make a new discovery, right? Or uncover something. And it turns out that you can really, I think this is a core concept that is really important, even if you don't know how it manifests itself, right? Which is the observations that you have while you were in the lab about a field or about a therapy, or in my case, about life science tools. And for me, I gravitated towards tools, and I should have recognized this earlier. Hopefully this is useful for you, but very early on, for instance, I was assessing 2 different RT-PCR machines in our lab. I put them both on the bench next to each other, which made the sales reps, as I'm sure you can appreciate, not overly happy. But then I wrote a 20-page document comparing the instruments, which I also provided to both companies. I should have realized that that was a pretty good indication that this is what I wanted to do, right? So I think that would be my other piece of advice: is look at what your passion work is, right? If you're really reading a lot, like even in your free time, about CAR T cells, that's a pretty good indication that's something that you should be working on, and you're already developing a strategy around it. You just haven't cultivated that yet. In my case, particularly later on in my postdoc, it was like, man, data analysis and integration is super challenging, right? And we weren't calling it multi-omics back then because we didn't have a buzzword for it. I think back then we were just saying, how can we cram all this data together on the same mice, right? And we were trying to use all kinds of stuff. I actually ended up hacking FlowJo to do it and then breaking FlowJo several times. And so ended up joining that company, taking it over in the middle of a huge amount of risk. I actually took it over with some issues that we'll describe in a little bit later, with some founder dysfunction. But then, over the course of, it seems like a decade, but I think it was 6 or 7 years, I saw a huge amount of data. I've seen more data than I even care to admit, and done data reviews. And you realize, we were working on algorithms for flow and for single cell. And at the end of the day, you sort of realize, wow, we're driving these new flow cytometers all on really old roads, like quite old roads. And it's the fluorescence that's really underlying this. It's an infrastructure problem. And it's interesting because we would always say things like, oh, well, crap in, crap out on the data analysis side. But the thing we could never fix, right? We would talk about standardization of instruments. We would talk about data quality, and things we could never fix was that fluorescence infrastructure. And so that was this thread that I really started focusing in on, thinking around, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of panels? What does that mean in terms of the antibody quality as well? And that led to me talking to the Phitonex team quite early, and then joining them as CEO. So, I'll be honest with you, I haven't developed the next thesis because there's so much to work on in reagents, as we'll discuss. But I think the things that I realized here is both think about what you are passionate about that you're doing in your free time that's scientific, because I know you're doing that, right? That we're all nerds, and just admit it and move on is really important. But at least for me, the advice I'd give you is also the things that frustrate you in the lab can be your greatest source of innovation if you have the courage to solve it. Because the life science tools in particular, because I'm obviously biased, is a unique environment. If you have an idea and you can turn it into a product, you can sell it tomorrow, right? In research use only, right? And I think that is both high contact. It's probably seems quite risky, particularly if you've never sold anything before. But at the same time, it's incredibly satisfying because customers will talk to you exactly about what they need, which I think ends up being a really beautiful relationship. So with some bias, but hopefully some useful advice. You need to act. This is not a passive process. Again, something that I didn't realize until much, much too late. Start way earlier than you need to. Networking, I think I have 2 slides on this. You need to accept that networking is a thing. Now, what does that mean in the current environment? Because obviously it's pretty hard to network over Zoom. I think this is going to be very interesting, possibly inflammatory, but I tried networking in person and it didn't work. Seta makes fun of me for saying that I'm partially introvert. She's like, if you're introverted, man. But that never worked because it was never targeted. I wasn't talking to the right people that I needed to be talking to. That's where, even in the current environment, informational interviews are your weapon of choice. They are an incredibly useful tool. What is an informational interview? You reach out to people who are in your immediate network, or people who went to the same undergraduate or graduate school as you did, or you ask people like me for introductions to people who are in a certain field, right? And you reach out to these people who are in some target industry or in a role that you want to have, right? Like, I want to have that job. Go talk to those people, several of them, and say, reach out to them either on LinkedIn or email and say, hey, can we connect for 20 minutes? I just want to learn about how you ended up in this role, how you ended up choosing that career path. And then get them on the phone for 20 minutes. And, people can generally speaking spare 20 minutes and just ask them about how they ended up there, ask them about their current role and try it on, right? I mean, put that jacket on and say, okay, like, does this fit? What do I think about this? Get their insight. And then also ask them who else you should be talking to, right? Because that's what you're doing. You're trying to explore that space. Informational interviews are just a key tool. I started them way too late, but they were incredibly useful, and it helped me understand, again, with the roles that I've crossed out and the roles that I wanted, which ones in there could I just really narrow down on and focus in on. I can't recommend those enough. That's what networking is going to mean 100%, honestly, in the current environment. It's going to be reaching out to people. The other part of this that I think is really hopefully important advice is productizing your research. This was something that I learned as I was talking to at that point, it was a large biotech company that ended up being bought by a pharma company, but they were like, well, what are you working on? And I started going off around dendritic cells and CD8 and co-stimulatory molecules and how NKs were influencing, and they're like, time out, right? And I'm like, wait, what? Well, what? This is how I talk when people ask me, in graduate school what I'm working on, and they're like, yeah, that's not what we're asking you, right? We're asking you for like the elevator story, like what specifically, like what are you working on concisely? Why should I care, right? And that's what I mean about productizing your research, right? And then actually, this is something that we force people when they're interviewing for a job at Phitonex to say, well, how would you what would you do with this? Like, what's the application? Why should I care? And that's not something that you're pushed to really do that. You kind of do that in your discussion. We think that, yeah, okay, but like when you're on the phone and someone asks you that point blank, you have to have a concise answer. And it's called an elevator story because it has to be about 15 seconds, right? Be okay with learning how to be pushy and assertive. This is something that, again, I came into a little bit late. And that just means, really, honestly, particularly with the informational interviews, is just following up. Don't assume that you're being ignored. Always assume that people are incredibly busy, right? And assume that most people that you're going to probably be interacting with or on Zoom or at home in the current environment. So they're even, not only are they busy, but their time is really constrained, right? So just think about that when you do these informational interviews. And the point is like follow-up is actually sometimes a test, right? Someone reaches out to you, and then, if you're on my side of the table, you'd say, I wonder if this person will follow up, right? I wonder if they're serious, or they haven't been specific enough about what they want to talk about for 20 minutes. So don't be afraid of following up. Don't be afraid of being ignored. It has nothing to do with you. The other part is this dealing with no. We already talked about this a lot, but you're going to get no's even as you accumulate these calls. That's fine. Explore that space. But it's a key weapon. And this is like my last, like, just hang with me. The difference between who you are and what you want to be is what you do. And so it is an active process of performing these informational interviews. Okay. Also, go find a high performance team. This is something that we'll actually discuss in a bit more detail, but what can a high performance team do? And this is one thing, regardless of where you go or what you do, this is the one that if someone's like, what's the key to success? It is either finding or creating a high performance team. The end. That's it. I mean, it sounds really simple, but it's not. What can a high performance team do? The answer is a ton, right? So when we were FlowJo, we were a company of only 18 people becoming more than 40. I call these ticker hitters because we hit, Illumina, Bio-Rads, and then BDX is, stock ticker. And we were some small little company in Oregon doing that. Similarly, in the Phitonex, it's been a very fast path. We've gone and said, well, look, we're releasing new types of fluorophores. We've shared 40 color flow cytometry data, and we've launched more labels in the first half of 2020 than we've seen, in the first, in the past 20 years. And so these are the thing to remember here, though, is that this has little to do with me. It has a lot to do with the fact that I'm part of a high performance team, right? And that is a critical piece to build it. The performance that you get from a team like this is above certainly what any individual can do, but it beats other teams. And that's, in the end, what you're looking for. Because regardless, I think a second thing to accept is if you're trying to do anything, you have to be part of a high performance team, and you're going to be competing against other teams. So you have to create the best team, right? Best team wins. And so, this is what we do with FlowJo. There was record growth. We built this thing up to 40 plus employees, had these landmark partnerships. It was acquired by BD in 2017. And Phitonex has been I'll be honest, is an incredible team, best team I've ever worked with. And I think you can see that manifest itself in the pace of what we're doing. It's not all drudgery, though. I'll say that. Here's some photos where I got to appear to show up to a party in a DeLorean, and then actually every single one of these is either a partner or a customer. So it's not all drudgery, right? And we'll talk a little bit about customers as well. But it's it turns out that a lot of this is quite fun. I'm obviously this was obviously in the pre-social distancing days. Part two are some core concepts, right? These are just things I wish I had learned, and we're going to cover as many as we can because I spent too much time going through those advice parts. And by the way, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box down below, and so I'll make sure that I pause with at least 5 minutes left when we go through those. The other thing, by the way, that if you're on this call, is you should be reaching out to connect on LinkedIn to Seton and I, right? I just told you the information on Reason Network are important. Please do that. So core concepts. If you can't swim with the sharks, get out of the water. I jumped in head first when I got out of academia, right? I discovered a situation which desperately needed a transition. And at the same time, I didn't have much formal training in business other than what I described to you. So it was swimming with the sharks, right? I think another thing that you need to recognize is that, when you do that and when you take your first role, you're going to experience something called imposter syndrome. You're going to think, is that me? Like, I'm not doing that? And the answer is yes. There's some great TED Talks on imposter syndrome. Everyone suffers from this. I think it's probably what I told somebody is the greatest lie of adulthood is that you walk around thinking that everybody else doesn't have those self-doubts, and they all do. Regardless, we'll peel off that psychology for a moment and ask who, why, how, and when. So I thought this was a really accurate way of describing people who are in really this band of life scientists who are, essentially not getting tenure yet, all the way back to people who are still in graduate school, which is the builders. You've reached adulthood on unstable ground. Boy, did 2020 make that even more true. They're opportunistic entrepreneurs, restless climbers, and deferential compromisers. I think that's interesting. I think it has interesting impacts on the way that you're going to cut your business. But I think, to me, this has always resonated with particularly the life scientists that I interact with. People are entrepreneurial in the sense of, I'd like to put in new tools. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're starting a business. Restless climbers? Oh, absolutely. Right? I see this left, right, and center. And deferential compromisers, I think, is really interesting, right? I think people are, the life scientists, in that, and it is a pretty big band, are really collaborative, and compromise on the right things, right? As opposed to just sort of fighting over silliness. Hopefully this sounds familiar to you. Okay, so that's the who, but why are we here, right? And the answer is, well, we really want to talk about some of these business fundamentals. So let me talk about disruption, failure. I'll talk a little bit more about high performance team. I'll talk about customers, and then we'll briefly cover negotiations. So these are actually just quite literal core skills that if I was like, these are the things that you should wrap your mind around as you enter any field where you think about opportunities therein. Hopefully this is useful. So disruption is one of those things it's a word that's been picked up by the popular press, but it actually has a scientific definition. And specifically what we're looking at here is product performance from low to high. And this is over time, right? And so what I'm mapping here is the low end of the market is the least profitable. This is the mainstream. And this is the high end of the market, most profitable. And this up here is like essentially the maximum performance that customers will pay for. And how disruption actually works is that, and I'll explain the how in a moment, is a smaller company with fewer resources successfully challenges incumbent businesses. Most people think that this is because of the speed, right, of a smaller business. That's certainly part of it, but it's not the whole picture. I'd say the majority of it is what I'll map out for you here. What happens is actually as the incumbents focus in on improving their products and services for their most demanding and then also their most profitable customers. And remember, this applies across the board, right? This can be therapy, this can be tools. This is the incumbent sustaining a trajectory. They improve. And what they do is they actually move up and out of the mainstream, right? And they ignore the needs of others, particularly the low end of the market, right? But what ends up happening is, they really have horse blinders, right? Because of those demands from their customers. What happens is you end up with this delta, which is this overserved and overlooked, right? And in our industry, what this ended up being was really people pushing up toward, this is about, I guess about 6 to 8 years ago, people really pushing on high parameter and then opening up this overserved and overlooked, which was then attacked by benchtop psychometers. And we're going to go through another generation of that, at least at Flow, but this happens in every single industry. The entrant comes in and they specifically serve the low end of the market, right? The least profitable part. And most of the time, incumbents ignore them. And what they do, though, is that eventually, because they can continue improving their product, the reason it becomes disruptive is because then they start serving the mainstream. So you can see that we've got these parallel lines move up. And when mainstream customers started adopting those entrance offerings in volume, that's when disruption has occurred, right? And so when you have essentially these lower offerings that fulfill the needs of overserved, they improve over time, and you get this disruption, and that's what happens in these blind spots. I think it's a really important thing. The other part too, now getting back to speed, because this is where speed comes in, is incumbents are incredibly slow in responding, right? And I think that's the most important thing. It's not that they're slow in developing for their high end of the market. It's that before this happens, they've already been disrupted in the mainstream of the market has been taken from them, right? And that's how disruption occurs. To me, this is a really core concept of how you look at a market and the way things are occurring over time, and you get this improvement of widespread adoption. This probably sounds familiar to you. I always, again, my bias is in life science tools, right? But this even occurs, and certainly occurs within the consumer markets, right? And you're seeing this all the time. You're probably even seeing it in your own laboratory, or also remember, we're also going to see this occur, within therapies as well, right? As we think about, well, what does that mean for democratizing, for instance, immunotherapy? What does it mean in 10 years when we're democratizing engineered T cells? Something to think about now. That's something you can hang your hat on strategically. So I want to point you to that core concept from Clayton Christensen, who's got some other great writings. But this is that key paradox, and we'll come back to customers in a second, which is leading companies succumb to one of the most popular and valuable management documents. They stay close to their customers. They stay too close to their customers, right? And then they move up the profitability chain with them. So it's actually a question back for you, which is, you might see an opportunity here, right, into something in your field frustrating you. So again, balancing that, the things you observe and the passion that you have. The point is too, remember, going back to this notion of how much risk are you willing to take on? I think the important thing that, again, I wish someone had told me is, you need to assess that level of commitment. How committed are you, right? And are you willing to make the leap to do that full time and really burn the lifeboats, right? This is not something, and this is quite literally a lifeboat that's on fire. Are you willing to jump in with both feet and work on this full time? Not on the side, right? Not as something that you play, not as a hobby, but as a full-time gig, right? And again, I think that this, while again kind of inflammatory, is really important, because if you're going to do what I just described, and make something that you're working on really make an impact, right? And either disrupt or gain market share, however you want to measure that, you do have to burn the lifeboats. To that point, it's worth talking to you just one more moment around these defaults, right? And I always like to sort of pull this up, right? Which is like, is this a vase or is this two faces? Because you're only going to see, and you're really only going to have the default of seeing in one way, and then you'll discover the second. I think it's the same thing when you think around, your field. At least from my perspective, I mapped this out pretty early and thought, well, okay, well, what are these things that I'm seeing that are defaults that aren't right? And for us, it was standardization, data sharing, data analysis, and reagents, right? And so you ask yourself a set of questions. What are opportunities in here? What am I missing? What are we missing? What's the field missing? What am I missing here? And what are we missing due to a default way of seeing, right? If you can consider a field that from the outside looking in, where are the weak points, right? And where are those opportunities? And so hopefully a useful way of thinking around that. And for us, that really manifested itself in one particular way, which is, when really, we used to have, if you look at a big binoculars, for instance, they have 40x magnification, right? And the effective magnification of the Hubble telescope, there's other optical caveats in here, is about 8,000-fold. And if you think about it, we've actually just recently made this leap, which is, we could reasonably do 40 proteins per cell. I think, certainly with some of the work we've shown, you can do it really well. If you're looking at a flow cytometry experiment, but on the flip side of this, we have 10,000 protein coding genes that are expressed in a typical human cell, and with whole transcriptome, we have access to that. So balancing this, what we have in flow, for instance, in the protein side, we have on the RNA side, is really, really tricky. And quickly, just to describe sort of the items where we started attacking, as we realized that like our current infrastructure only behaved in two different ways. Floors were either narrowly excited but broadly emissive, or they were cross-excited by multiple lasers. But okay, well, that's going to provide a fundamental limitation. Like, we won't be able to go past an asymptote on colors. And in fact, what we found is, when you map out all the different, flow cytometry or even mass cytometry panels, over time in terms of number, and then map that versus proteins that are being assayed by some of these newer technologies, particularly like sequence-tagged antibodies, either TotalSeq or AbSeq, someone has moved the cheese, right? By an order of magnitude in the number of proteins that you can measure. And so for me, this really meant, wow, this is really interesting. I mean, this was occurring, sort of in the latter part of when I was at FlowJo and then in BD. And I think the realization that we came to as a team, particularly over the past year, was, wow, we really are in this reagents revolution, at least in single cell. And that's the biggest need and the biggest opportunity, right? Hardware from the LSR2 to having lasers that cover the whole spectrum. There's nowhere else to go there, right? You can throw more detectors and more lasers. Software from the first K-means algorithm to some recent work on compensation is honestly somewhat figured out. I mean, there's lots of complicated and very good algorithms to analyze the data. But reagents really starting from moving this cheese by an order of magnitude, I think at least for the next 10 years, is going to be where we focus in on that, again, focusing in on that infrastructure. And so I'll skip past that. That's just some thesis that we've had around, well, what does that mean? I'll also say too, is again, and I keep pushing on this, in terms of having a strategy for your career as well, is that your idea will be 1,000 times better, at least, right? And you have to believe that. And if you don't, and really my role, I always tell people, is my role is to be the cheerleader, right? Is to say, is that idea going to work, and to pressure test that and to enable people, right? How can I help? I think is the most powerful question. To that point, you might think, okay, well, I might have an idea, but a lot of businesses fail. And also you mentioned risk earlier, like what does that mean? Well, there's fact, fiction, and bad statistics here. So this is just a data I'll dump. 8 out of 10 entrepreneurs who start businesses fail in the first 18 months. 96% of businesses fail in 10 years. About half of all new establishments survive 5 years or more, and about 1/3 survive to 10 years or more. Yes, you'll notice that these are different. The point is like there's this, I think, this popular trope in the business literature that the vast majority of these businesses fail, right? But they never get into why, ever. And so, but I'm a scientist, so I like to think about this. Why? Why do they fail? Why? If there's a reproducibility crisis in science, there's a much bigger one in business. So why is that? Why do businesses fail? And like, what are the causative reasons? And so I try to brainstorm out all of the different things that can occur in a business: founder dysfunction or dysfunctional management, out of control growth, bad accounting, lack of cash, operational mediocrity, not talking to customers, no differentiation, no clear value proposition, inability to nail a profitable business model, not enough demand, addressable market too small. If you were to look back at this, scientists don't speak the majority of these languages. You probably can see dysfunctional management because you might have experienced it or at least observed it when you're in graduate school, so you can at least sense it. But all of these things, particularly those in purple, no one is taught those in graduate school. So if you're thinking about getting into scientific business, those are some areas, obviously, to going up on, but they're things to be aware of. The other thing too that I'll say is, we also are working in an environment, unless you're in RUO, where there's FDA regulation. There's also large concerns around IP. What's the patent term? Also, when does do you have any non-confidentialities or non-competes, right? But the other thing too that I see quite a bit of is, are you going to be taken advantage of early, right? Is someone going to, essentially have you divulge IP that they can then use? So these are reasons that businesses fail, right? The other thing that I would encourage you to think about is like, what kind of business venture partnership are you going to have to affect that kind of change, right? And I think that's important, right? And again, it maps out is if there's a current industry partner who's affecting that kind of change and it's a high performance team, join them, right? And if not, think about, okay, well, how would this manifest itself? Is it a startup? Is it already an existing business? Is this a new grant? Is this a partnership or alliance or consortium, right? How will this manifest itself? How will this organization of humans actually accomplish this one thing? How is this question, right? So in Flow, we always think about backdating what's really truly going on between all these causes of failure. So I've backdated this further. Inability to build and maintain a high performance team, I think, is the number one cause of failure in business, right? Because it leads to most of the causes of all these other ones. The other one is not customer committed, again, appropriately so. Rather than following your highest, most profitable customers. Lack of potentiating partnerships and relationships is another really big one. Again, there's this notion that you can't do it alone, and guess what? It comes up twice, right? But I think the other part that you're not taught in graduate school, no one likes to talk about, is also just this notion that if you back it one step further, you do have to have some humility. You have to realize that you don't and can't do everything. It is not graduate school. It is not your postdoc. And you're going to have to lean on more people. And I'll be honest, and as I move from the FlowJo role, the VD role, and then now the lead Phitonex, I am much more disciplined about reaching out for help on items where I am not the expert, right? And that can be across the board, right? If it's in some of our applications, it's me talking to Seton. If it's finance, it's me talking to the two finance experts we use, right? And I think that's the discipline that you get, or maybe that's wisdom. I have no idea. It's probably just scars. But that's really important, is just to have that humility to accept you are not the expert. You need help and perspective. It's not about you. You can't do it alone. So you're probably sensing some things here. Right? Again, it's just that I would entreat you to consider what team you're joining and how you're going to affect that change is entirely directed by the team you're joining and help you surround yourself with. Also, let's just be honest, no one wants to work for a jerk with a great idea. You nor me nor anybody is Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. In fact, only they are they, right? You shouldn't think, I want to manage like him. That's a really ridiculous thing to say. And in fact, we've seen this in life science too, where Google tried to start this life science effort, and they've gone through now a number of leaders there where everyone leaves over someone who honestly thought he was Steve Jobs, right? No one wants to work for a jerk, right? Let's just be honest, right? And particularly in this environment, I think we've had enough of dealing with jerks in leadership roles that we should set a higher standard for our leaders that are in life science. What does a high performance team mean? This is something actually that has a definition, right? And actually there are people that have tracked high performance teams in the way that they outperform low performance teams. So this is a foundational definition. It's something you're very, very interested in. I've got some citations at the end about this, but I wanted to kind of break this down. It is a team performing at the opposite end of something that suffers from sort of founderitis or founder dysfunction, which is a group of people with specific roles. The way we think about this in the Phitonex environment is everyone has to be a superhero at particularly one thing. They have to be good at the other things, but they have to be really, really good at that specific role. Complementary talents and skills, not personalities. Super important, right? These things need to fit together like puzzle pieces in terms of their talents and their skills, right? But we worry a little bit less on sort of on the personality side. We know that if they have those complementary talents and skills and they have a different way of thinking, then it'll be of value. Aligned with and committed to a common purpose. We articulate that, right? So for instance, in every business I've been a part of, a culture deck and a purpose and values have been part of it. And then we enact those. It's not just like things up on a wall. Enron had a mission statement, right? So did Theranos. Doesn't mean anything unless you actually act on it. Consistency, still high levels of collaboration and innovation, right? And anytime that you're not acting as a high performance team, you'll see collaboration, communication, and innovation just crater. In innovation, people treat that as magic, and it's really not. I think it's actually, if you assemble a high performance team and you're working on an interesting problem and you have a strategy, you will get innovation as a byproduct. There's a great author, and I've got his book here at the end. He actually said, he went even further on this notion of like, what does a business create? And his quote was, I'm not making this up, that profit is the excrement of a high performing business, which is a pretty intense statement, but really, really interesting when you consider the type of business that he was building. They also produce superior results. I've sort of shown you at least an example of that. But I would just push on you so hard when you're interviewing with teams, you're thinking about creating your own team, regardless of the environment, is really focusing on this notion of a high performance team. It is going to be what is going to be the make or break item in your career. And I've had the fortune to do this twice, right? Where we took a small team, for instance, at FlowJo that was about 20-ish, a little bit over 20 at that time. This is actually this is a slide from when we were actually hiring another 12 people to build this team to over 40. The vast majority of these people are actually still with that team there. And again, a high performance team. But that being said, this is the surprise slide for the team, which we have just an incredible team at Phitonex, and it really is all about this high performance team. Ours is much more technically leaning because that's the nature of our business. But this notion of being on a high performance team, just it makes a world of difference, and it also frankly makes it a fun place to work. And if I'm wrong, you can message Seton privately and say, is he being real? And a last point here before we get into negotiation is that everyone has customers, and you can't. This is something that, again, I wish I realized and wish I could go back and talk to more academic PIs about, is that you do have customers. You have people who are reading your papers. You have people who are citing your papers. You have people who are going to give you grants. They're customers. They are consuming your work product, right? And it's certainly the same thing on our side, right? Where we have customers. But I think a little bit of perspective there is when you talk about the framework of having customers, It's different than giving a seminar, right? It's different than just delivering information, right? Something that I still have to remind myself. But everyone is fighting a silent battle you know nothing about. I would argue that particularly lately, this has become something that we actually can admit. I started talking about this about 7 years ago, and it was a really uncomfortable topic. But now everyone's like, "Yeah, you're right, right? Why are you there? Why are you talking to a customer? You're there to improve their lives, help, or work them to create a better, happier future. That's what you're working towards. Full stop. That's what a value proposition is. You need to listen, connect, and understand what their problem is. But the other thing too that I think is really important is it is not on the customers to design that solution. It is your job to solve that problem. Right? That's why it's in our, at least the tools market, that's why you're there. That's your job and your obligation, right? And that's not to say that we don't listen to customers, we don't take their feedback. That's not it. But we're the ones who have to take that on and design a solution, right? And I think that that's an important distinction. One that my former business partner was really always on me about is like, get as much customer insight as humanly possible, take that back in, digest it, and then come up with a solution, because that is your obligation. Right? And this is my interaction framework for customers, just so you can have this. And by the way, it's the same thing for your informational interviews. It's the same thing when you're talking to a reviewer, right? How can I help, right? Or how can we help you? It seems like a presumptuous statement, but that's the point. It's we're going to help, right? But I need to know how. Listen, connect to solutions, be always honest about shortcomings, man. And Shad and I talked exhaustively about this, which is be very honest. We don't know is one of the most powerful things you can say in life science. It doesn't even matter where you are. We don't know, or we haven't done that work yet, or it's an experiment in progress. Geek out and be transparent. We're starting to talk about transparent stuff, but get excited about what you're doing. I have actually seen far too many graduate students, postdocs, and then even people who are anywhere along their career just sort of flip through some slides, oh, well, we did this. Get excited about it. This is your life. I mean, you don't have another shot at this, right? Ask them what they think. This is a super powerful tool. What do you think? What's your insight on this, right? Particularly in life science, I think this is an incredibly powerful tool to get insight. Listen, get excited about their ideas. Because invariably someone's going to give you an idea, or they're coming in with expertise that you have no idea about, right? Or some specific cell type or tissue. And this happens daily, and I think it's one of the greatest joys, honestly, of at least in our business, interacting with customers, is getting that expertise. It's a gift, right? The other thing too, and I've been remiss in this lately, is here are my follow-up items in marching orders. Are there any other ways we can help, right? And you take the actions on. Right? And I would imagine that, particularly if I'm talking to folks who are out there who are in academia, this would be a very powerful way of doing it. Okay, a final word about negotiation, because I'm actually trying to keep this on time. You do non-distributive negotiation every day, you just don't realize it. It's actually a form of communication. If you're like, well, where are we going to go to dinner, hopefully outside, social distance, tonight, you're having a non-distributive negotiation, right? And that means it is a there's not money on the table, because invariably, that's different. You're dealing with the Pareto frontier, and generally speaking, most distributive negotiations end up at the average. And you can look at that by looking at real estate data over time. What I'm talking about is non-distributive negotiations, where there's a lot more at play and you've got a lot more intangibles. Negotiation is communication. So there's an incredible book. It is the only book you should read on negotiation. It is so important that I don't even have it as a prop. It just literally sits on my desk. It's called Getting to Yes. I don't even want to admit how many books about negotiation. This is the only one. The fundamental concept, I think, is super important. And I actually gave this to a former team of mine, and most of them came back and said, actually, this is a book about communication. Separate people from the problem, focus on interests rather than positions, generate a variety of options before settling on an agreement, insist that the agreement be based on objective criteria. This is super important. And I've taken this a step further and asked, how do you plan for an experiment? This is actually the way I prepare for every negotiation. And I'm very public about it. So here you go, now you know, which is, what's the negotiation and role? What's the partner's name and role? This is an important thing. What's this negotiation supposed to be about? And I ask another question. What is it actually about? Right? And that turns out to be a really powerful question. Then you think about your interests. What are the other party's interests? What are my interests? What are the BATNAs, best alternative to a negotiating agreement? BATNAs are what creates leverage, right? Because you can have another alternative. Options and issues, brainstorm ways to expand the pie or find a mutually attractive agreement. This is really important. This is the notion of the Pareto frontier. As you move out the value, you can actually create more value along the Pareto frontier, because you have created options and you have put more into the pie. I've done deals that were not at the Pareto frontier, right? For instance, on a previous deal that we did with a very large company, we didn't include lead passing and some sales partnerships. It was not on the Pareto frontier, right? And I can look back at that. Standards, need, fairness, market rates, industry benchmarks, et cetera, right? And you can see that, by the way, this can inform a distributed negotiation if you're around salary or your startup package as an academician or any of these items. Proposals, think in terms of multi-issue packages. This is important too. I do find that scientists tend to kind of very similar to like a scientific problem, break it down into its components. Turns out you're kind of dinged in negotiation for do that. You should always think about packaging and trading, but then mapping out the outcome and your intention for this negotiation. This is core. If you can do this, you're going to walk away from most of your negotiations, not having won, because it's not about winning or losing, but creating substantial amounts of value. So build your BATNA, no matter what the negotiation is, more options and more leverage. Ignorance can be good. I actually don't have time to tell the story, so it'll have to be a follow-up, which is about information asymmetry, and then packaging and trading is really, really important. One last slide about really when you can do more advanced negotiation, because I see we've got some Q&A, is context control. If you are the one who is presenting, or you are the one who is initiating the agenda, or whatever it may be, if you can control that context or drive that context, you can in many ways control the conversation. And that's a critically important thing. Semantic hacking, this is something that where if you're trying to, for instance, join an organization and you're trying to make them see you as part of that team, go read what they write, go understand the vocabulary that they use, right? Every company has a way of speaking in a vocabulary, lingua franca, that they use. And you can use those words in the conversation, and it'll make any idea or the fact or even the idea of you working there much more palatable. Physiology is really another interesting one. People tend to have a fight or flight response, right, in the context of being challenged. And and this is something that is a continued challenge, right? I think particularly for people who are in life science, where conflict is generally speaking not what we go for. We try to do constructive conflict rather than just bang our heads together. And the other part is just sort of is leading them to ask what you want. And I always put the ellipsis there because I can't share all my secrets. I'll just leave up this slide around recommended reading as well. Just some really great books in here, and then hopefully we've got 4 or 5 minutes here for Q&A, for follow-up, for however you guys want to take this. But hopefully a useful session and some useful advice.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. So we've got a few questions. So one of them is, what advice do you have for someone trying to figure out a career trajectory in industry/startup, but not sure if they want to be a founder, CEO, or in the boardroom?
Yeah, there's such a gradient there, right? I think if you, to hit the founder question first, if you have, let's assume, for instance, you're at a university, you've got intellectual property, and like that's what you want to work on, and that's what you want to out-license and create your startup around. I think that's an incredible experience. I do see a lot of failure points there, though, just to be aware. Some of those failure points are who is going to burn the lifeboats to join that organization full time, who's really going to drive that. Other sort of sensitive areas would be around how early do you get legal help involved so that you're thinking about it from the business perspective, because you're now forming a business and you're not really working for the university anymore, and balancing those two relationships, because you think you're still part of the university, because you are, but you need to start thinking like a business, like you already have that business entity, even if it doesn't exist when you're having those licensing conversations. I think a lot of things honestly fail right there in that founder piece. So maybe a bit of specific advice there. I think one of the things that is without a doubt useful is, even if that doesn't come to pass, exploring what you need to do to get there is critically important, because the startup that you end up, let's assume you go off and you say, well, I don't have enough to start here, or there's something that makes me uncomfortable here. I'm going to go off and join a startup somewhere along that gradient. The skills that you would learn, even in scoping that, are going to be incredibly useful to the next employer. Imagine the difference between you saying like, well, we thought we were going to do that, but or, well, this is what we did. We negotiated, we started negotiating a license, here's the IP, and it didn't end up being the right fit because of X, but because of that, I've got this experience base. So hopefully some useful advice. I think, I'd say also, reach out if you've got specific items there that I haven't spoken to.
Okay, we got another question. So are there added challenges if trying to transition from a senior management role in a small company/startup into a similar role in a larger, more established company? In other words, are lateral moves between these two organizations possible?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. It's one that Yeah. So what will happen in these conversations, because I've had them before, is someone will say, well, you haven't worked at this scale before, right? And so they'll look at like a head count, or like a P&L level of responsibility. For instance, if it's a research role and you've got a certain segment of P&L or a certain segment of budget, and they'll say, well, you really haven't worked at this level before. I think what I would say there in my advice would be is and I'll be honest, this has been leveled against me, have a counter argument ready. And I didn't. I just kind of deer in the headlighted it and said, and I think you have to realize that it is not about scale, because when you break down any management of any team, you're going to end up managing the exact same size team. So it is that, it'll probably end up being, if it's a standard sort of the management ratio, it's going to be 7, although obviously we've seen that shift lately where people are generally speaking maybe managing anywhere even from 10 to 12 people. I think you have to explain to them, look, I've managed a team of the exact same size that's going to be my direct reports. They also have reports, and look at the performance that we had. Here are the results. And this is what I would do inside of this larger company, even though there's more scale. I think you have to sort of control that narrative. I wish I had known how to do that earlier, to say, look, I get that. I understand where you're coming from, but this is how I lead a team. And whether that be a team of people who are executors or they themselves are leaders, it doesn't really matter, right? The analogs are all the same. And this notion of scale, I don't think really adds up much when you're considering that lateral move. If anything, it's going to be the results that you're accomplishing in that startup and that track record that you're going to take forward and say, that's what we can do. So hopefully useful advice. And again, that's more like, I sort of wish someone had walked me through how to do that.
Yeah. I have one question that, yes, you're showing graphs at the beginning of sort of working at these various places. How did you find sort of along the way that they gave more clarity, sort of where you get generally sort of thinking, okay, I want to be in business, but I don't know where I want to be? Did each one of them help resolve kind of where you wanted to be? Or did the work driving where you went?
That's a great question, Seth. I think, I had a band in there of, because I was still, like every life scientist, I was talking to pharma and biotech companies. And I think I realized that there were certainly some roles that had perhaps more responsibility, but lower risk reward profiles down at the lower end of that graph, but that the learning I would have would still be constrained, right? It was still like you're being hired to be the PhD to do this part of the science. And I certainly think for me, it was, if you will, almost mapping the Euclidean distance of saying, I want to do some of that, right? But I also want it, like, let's say it's a pie chart. I want my job to be 50% of the science, but there's these other things that excite me, right? Whether it be presenting or even working on the financial side of the business. I mean, whatever that might be. And I realized that the other side of the pie was sort of sliced into multiple pieces. And I realized, look, if I move further up this chain or take on more risk, that pie chart, if you will, the things that I want to do is going to be more satisfied, right? Even if someone else is offering me, let's call it, honestly, more money or a more senior role, I'm not going to be happy in that position. The way that I explored that, though, to get it down to practicalities, is I did a ton of informational interviewing in that realm for the jobs I thought I might want to do, right? And literally asking them, like, what do you do? Like, what is your day-to-day? What are you frustrated about? Like, where do you want to go, right? And realizing, man, because in many ways, again, going to that notion of trying it on, you're like, I couldn't be that person, right? And like, you'll have that visceral response, right? And like, because and this notion of like gut is literally like you're having an intuition around like, that's not gonna work for me, right? And I think, honestly, I did a lot of that. And then there were other ones where I just didn't know. So I think scoping, for instance, these industrial postdocs and looking at that and then realizing that's not gonna work, right? Or like, ooh, that seems like even structurally. So you have, for instance, there was a postdoc that I spoke to at a large pharma. Well, we have a 5-year program, but we're not guaranteed work on the end of this. And we're not really a full-time employee. It's like, but you wouldn't learn that if you didn't have that call, right? Because you go to the website and you're like, wow, this looks amazing. So I think for me, that was a key weapon in exploring that space. And then again, ruling things out and then realizing, okay, where in that risk gradient do I want to live?
Right. So we don't have any other questions. We can wait a few minutes to see if anyone else has anything.
Cool. Yeah, we'll post up the recording as well. And then please, any feedback too. So the easiest email to remember is info@phitonex.com, PHITONEX. But then my name, mike.sadisky@phitonex.com. You can email me, or you can email Seddon and be like, is he actually fun to work with? Or is he full of it? I always tell people, don't take my word for it, right? I feel like Lamar Barton reading Rainbow. But yeah, you can send her an email as well. And please reach out to us on LinkedIn too.
Yes, definitely.
Cool. Thank you, Seddon.
Happy to do it. And happy to actually learn more about your path. So.
Cool.